Good evening. So tonight I'm going to be reading a fairy tale from the World's Best Fairy Tales book. This was my grandfather's book, and I believe it was a Reader's Digest compilation book. So they compiled what they thought were the world's greatest fairy tales into this book, and many of them are really good fairy tales. This is this book is from 1967, so long before I was born. It was my grandfather's, and it does have a lot of really awesome fairy tales in it. A lot of the classics like Cinderella and Snow White, but then a lot of some really rare ones that you don't hear very often. So there's the golden-headed fish, and there's Dick Whittington and his cat, Sinbad the Sailor, which is one of my absolute favorites. And I don't know if you ever read the original version of The Little Mermaid. Not quite the happy fairy tale that the Disney version is, but tonight we're going to read one that's kind of a classic. We're going to flip to page 664 and read Sleeping Beauty. And don't worry, this is not the original version of Sleeping Beauty, which is definitely not an appropriate bedtime story if you've ever read the original Italian version. This is still a nice fairy tale version. Sleeping Beauty. There once lived a king and a queen who were sorry they had no children. So sorry that it cannot be expressed. They tried all the curative waters in the world, vows and pilgrimages, but to no purpose. At last, however, the queen gave birth to a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. They managed to locate 7, and so the princess was endowed with all the perfections imaginable. After the christening, the company returned to the king's palace, where a great feast was prepared for the fairies. Before every one of them was placed a magnificent casket of massive gold, wherein were a spoon, knife, and fork of pure gold, set with diamonds and rubies. But as they were sitting down at table, they saw come into the hall a very old fairy who had not been invited. It was more than 50 years since she had been seen, and everyone believed that she was either dead or enchanted. The king ordered a place set for her, but could not furnish her with a casket of gold because only 7 had been made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy felt that she was intentionally slighted, and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her overheard her grumbling. Judging that she might give the little princess some unlucky gift, the young fairy went, as soon as they rose from the table, and hid herself behind the drapes so that she might speak last and repair, as much as she could, any evil which the old fairy intended. Meanwhile, all the fairies began to offer their gifts to the princess. The youngest, for her gift, said that the princess should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she should have wonderful grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of music to perfection. The old fairy's turn came next. With her head shaking more with spite than age, she said that the princess should have her hand pierced with a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody began to weep. At this very instant, the young fairy came out from behind the drapes and spoke these words. Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die. It is true I have no power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a profound sleep which shall last for 100 years. After that time, a king's son shall come and wake her. The king, to avoid the misfortune, immediately forbade spinning with a distaff and spindle, or to have so much as a spindle in the house. About 15 or 16 years later, the king and queen happened to be visiting one of their other castles, and the young princess was diverting herself by running up and down the palace. She came into a little room at the top of the tower where an old serving woman was spinning with her spindle. This woman had never heard of the king's proclamation against spindles. "What are you doing there, my good woman?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my dear child," said the old woman. "Ah," said the princess, "this is very pretty. How do you do it? Give it to me so I may see." She had no sooner taken the spindle than it ran into her hand, and she fell down into a swoon. The good old woman cried out for help. People came and threw water upon the princess's face, and unlaced her dress, and rubbed her hands and temples with perfume, but nothing would bring her to herself. And now the king, who had returned to the palace, came up at the noise, remembered the prediction of the fairies, and, judging very well that this must necessarily come to pass since the fairies had said it, had the princess carried into the finest apartment in his palace, and laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold. One would have taken her for a little angel, she was so very beautiful. Her swooning had not dimmed her complexion, for her cheeks were carnation and her lips were coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which satisfied those about her that she was not dead. The king commanded that she be left to sleep quietly till her hour of awakening should come. The good fairy who had saved the life of the princess by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 miles off, when this accident befell the princess. But she was instantly informed of it by a little dwarf who had boots with which he could go 7 leagues in one stride. The fairy came immediately, riding in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out of the chariot, and she approved everything he had done. But she touched with her wand everything in the palace, except the king and queen, governesses, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, scullions, guards, pages, and footmen. She likewise touched the horses in the stables, the great dogs in the courtyard, and even pretty little Mopsy, the princess's spaniel, which lay at the foot of her bed. The minute she touched them, they all fell asleep, that they might not awake before their mistress, and might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits at the fire, loaded with partridges and pheasants, fell asleep also, as did the fire. This was done in a moment, for fairies are not long in doing their magic. And now the king and queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace, and in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all around the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles twining so thickly one within another that neither man nor beast could pass through. Nothing could be seen of the castle but only the very tops of the towers, and those only from a great distance. When 100 years had passed, another family ruled the kingdom. The son of the king, then reigning, chanced to go hunting and asked about the towers which he saw in the middle of the great thick wood. All answered according to the stories they had heard. Some said it was a ruined old castle haunted by spirits. Others said that it was where sorcerers and witches held their night meetings. The common opinion was that it belonged to an ogre, who carried there as many little children as he could catch. The prince was at a loss, not knowing what to believe, when a very aged countryman spoke to him. "May it please your royal highness, about 50 years ago I heard from my father, who heard from my grandfather say, that there was in this castle a princess, the most beautiful ever seen, who must sleep there 100 years, and should be awakened by a king's son." The young prince was fired by these words, thinking it a gay and rare adventure, and inspired by a wish for love and honor. He resolved that moment to look into it. Hardly had he advanced toward the wood, when all the great trees, the bushes and brambles gave way of themselves to let him pass. He walked up a long avenue to the castle. What surprised him was that he saw none of his people could follow. The trees closed behind him as soon as he passed through. A young prince is always valiant, however, and he continued on his way. He came into a spacious outer court, where everything he saw might have frozen the most fearless person with horror. There was a frightful silence, and nothing to be seen but the stretched-out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. He knew, however, by the ruddy faces of the porters, that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still remained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they had fallen asleep in their cups. The prince then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the guard-room, where guards were lined up, their muskets upon their shoulders, and snoring as loudly as they could. After that he went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he came into a chamber, gilded with gold, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were open, the finest sight the young prince ever beheld. A princess who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years old, and whose radiant beauty had a somewhat unearthly quality. He approached, trembling with admiration, and fell down before her upon his knees. And now, as the enchantment was at an end, the princess awoke, and looking on the prince with eyes more tender than a first glance might seem to admit, "Is that you, my prince?" said she. "I have waited a long while." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her he loved her better than he did himself. There was little eloquence but a great deal of love in their talk. He was more at a loss than she, and we need not wonder at it. She had had time to think on what to say to him, for it is very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very agreeable dreams. In short, they talked for hours, and yet they said not half what they had to say. Meanwhile, the rest of the palace awoke, everyone went about his own business, and as they were not in love, they were ready to die of hunger. The chief lady-in-waiting grew very impatient, and told the princess loudly that supper was served. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was dressed magnificently, but his royal highness took care not to tell her she was dressed like his great-grandmother in pictures he had seen, even to the lace band peeping over her collar. She looked not a bit less charming and beautiful for all that. They went into the great hall of mirrors, where they supped and were served by the princess's officers. The musicians played old tunes very excellently, even though it was now over 100 years since they had touched their instruments. When supper was over, they were married in the chapel of the castle, and though the bride was 100 years older than the groom, nobody would ever have guessed it. A few days later, the prince took his bride to live with him in his own palace, and the enchanted castle and wood vanished, never to be seen again. And so that's all for this week. I will see you all again next week with a standard sci-fi or fantasy role play. Though if you would like to hear another fairy tale at some point, let me know. There are a lot of fairy tales in this book. As I said, Sinbad is one of my favorites. The Tinderbox, the Little Goose Girl. There's quite a few different fairy tales in this book. And then, of course, there's the common ones, as I said, the Frog Prince and Snow White and Cinderella and Thumbelina, things like that. So there's a fairy tale that you would like to hear read at some point, let me know. These are all in the public domain, so I'm not infringing on anybody's copyright by reading them here. So in the meantime, I hope that you're all asleep by now and have a wonderful rest of the evening.